so thankful to be with you this Sunday morning. As I begin, I want to share a couple weeks ago. So we have two cats. They're both indoor-outdoor cats. And one of our cats, the name is Phantom. And we got him more recently. And about 3 weeks ago, he got out and didn't come back. And this cat is kind of annoying in the sense that he's like too friendly. So like the people walking in our neighborhood, dogs, like he's very unbothered. So he's like at dogs. We get calls all the time. Like he's at the tennis court, whatever. Are you looking for your cat? We're like, no. We're not. So eventually we got him a collar without a phone number on it so that people could leave us alone. But he was gone for 3 days and we didn't get a phone call, which was weird because we got calls all the time. And so Finley, our daughter, she said, well, let's make those like missing cat posters. And I was like, Finley, you can do that. It's not going to work. Because if he was around, somebody would have called us, and but you can do that if you want, but he's not coming back. Or if he does, it's not going to be because of that. I was very confident of this. And so she made these posters, put them on a few, like lampstand things outside. And later that night, we got a text, is this your cat? And so I guess our cat decided to go to someone's house who doesn't want to call us. And the next day we go get our cat, and he's got like pictures of our cat playing with their dog and their kids and doing all these things. But I, share that story because I didn't think it would make any difference. Now, since the return of this cat, we have gotten it's actually kind of cool, a cat collar with an air tag, so you can like see where he is at all times. And there is no phone number on this collar, so nobody can call us if he's out there. But I didn't think it was going to work, and it did. And I share that because today, as we continue our time in the book of James, here's the question for us this morning. How do you know if you trust in God or yourself? How do you know if you trust in God or yourself, if you're actually following Jesus or yourself? And again, if you've been with us in the book of James, we might think these questions are easy to answer, and so we allow God's word to challenge us. Again, with our cat, Phantom, I figured I knew what the answer was, and I was wrong. And so how do we know whether we're following God or ourselves? And so if you have a Bible, will you turn me to James chapter 4? James chapter 4 is what we pick up this morning. If you don't have a Bible, there's a black one in front of you, and you can take one of those homes if you do not own a Bible. That is our gift to you. Now, James chapter 4, last week, he started talking about pride and how that can impact us and lead to all sorts of issues in our life. And today, that kind of underlying theme is going to continue as we continue this next section in chapter 4, verse 13. Here is what James writes. He says, come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will travel to such and such a city and spend a year there and do business and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring, what your life will be. For you are like a vapor that appears for a little while, then vanishes. Now, it's easy to read these first couple of verses of this passage and think, what is wrong with planning? After all, you need to plan if you're going to run a business or run your life. Like you have to plan for things. Even Proverbs talks about the wisdom of planning for things. The problem that James is going to address, as we'll see here in a couple of verses, is not planning per se. It's not wanting to make money because you need resources to live. The issue that James has is the arrogance that we can have in our planning. Right? The problem is that when we assume that things are going to play out the way that we think they are going to play out, as if we controlled the future. And so James's reminder here is, hey, remember, life is short. You are here today, you are gone tomorrow. Your life is like a vapor. And especially even more so for Christians. Again, James is writing to Jewish Christians in the first century in Jerusalem. And he's like, listen, if you believe in God, then you know you're not in control. So you should not live as if you are. Again, even the book of Proverbs warns about this. In Proverbs 27, it says this, don't boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day might bring. And so instead, what we should do is we consider our plans and think about our futures. This is what we should do. He says this in verse 15. He says, instead, you should say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. In other words, instead of saying or thinking this is what we will do, we should not be so presumptuous. In light of the fact, again, that our lives are a vapor, that we should plan our lives with God in mind, the one who, by the way, is actually over everything. In other words, for James, it's not just enough to recognize the shortness of life. Again, you don't even have to believe in God to know you're not going to live forever. So it's not just that. You also need to consider him. Consider him in your plans. Now, again, the book of James takes a lot from the teachings of Jesus, particularly in the Sermon on the Mount. There's a lot of those echoes in this book. And in this Sermon on the Mount, we also have Jesus's the Lord's Prayer. And part of the Lord's Prayer, it says this in Matthew 6, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's about this idea of like planning and asking and considering and bringing in the Lord in what you are doing. And so for James then, it's not just about the humility needed in making plans, hey, we're going to do this if the Lord allows it to happen, which is important part of it. But it is also honoring him in the making of plans. In other words, is this the type of plan that honors God, or is this dishonoring to God? Or maybe just to sum up the beginning of this passage, here's what James is saying, that you and I should consider the Lord in your plans. That you should consider the Lord in your plans. That this will happen if God allows, or there should be some humility there. And is this something good and honorable to God? Right? So to plan and to live your life without considering the Lord, according to James, is arrogance, as we're about to see in just a couple sentences. And so for us, man, if you think about your own life, in your job, or in your family, in your vacation, and you're considering moving somewhere, in a relationship, that James is saying we should consider the Lord in these things. Now, this is not meant to paralyze or overcomplicate every decision. It's not like, well, should we go to like this restaurant or this restaurant tonight? Like, I think either one of those is probably not dishonoring the Lord, but just big picture, say, hey, are we considering, like, how are we doing considering the Lord in our plans? Like, I think of, like, for Christine and I, we're kind of in a forced season of this, of having to actually, like, do this practically. We've shared, many of you kind of know, we're foster parents, and honestly, it feels weird to say that. We kind of feel like we're more just foster licensed. And so last summer, it's been about a year now, we finished our foster licensing. We had a foster son for 2 months last year. His name was Nehemiah, and then he got reunited with another foster family that had one of his biological brothers staying with him, and then there was nothing. And so eventually we changed our agency from the agency we were with to Wake County because there's more of a need in Wake County. And it took like 3 months, forever. It took forever for our license to get transferred, even though like we were already done. In fact, in February, they were saying, yeah, our social worker was like, hey, we wish you were licensed right now. You know, we got all these cases. And I wanted to be like, well, if you guys did your job, it would be. But I didn't say that, right? And so then March 1, our license goes through. And so we're thinking, okay, well, now they just told us they have all this need, nothing. So we're a month and a half into being our license transferred. We've only gotten 2 phone calls for kids that were way outside our age range. And so I share that, be like, man, when we got into foster care, we had a lot of like assumptions or thoughts of what it's going to look like. And you kind of know it's going to be unpredictable. They could have a kid here, it could be changed from week to week. But what we never thought was we'd be licensed for a year and only foster 1 kid. That's not what we thought. And so even now, like as we think for the future, as we're like plan vacations and all these things, it's like, man, well, if we have an extra kid or 2 extra kids, and depending on their age and their gender, because there are all these rules for various certain things, it's even kind of hard right now to like plan the future because we have no idea. And so even that is kind of like forcing us to kind of, in some ways, try to live this out. Like this really is, hey, this is what we're going to do unless God does something different. And so for us, man, if I can make this really practical, what this looks like for us is praying, hey, Lord, is this something that you would allow? And that you would ask the Lord to shape your thought or your decision-making process. And even considering the Lord will even change maybe some of the decisions you make. So let me give you an example. Like maybe you're thinking like, hey, maybe it's Friday and you're excited, you just got paid and you're going out with your friends. Like if you're like, hey, God, hey, I'm going to go out this Friday night with my friends. And Lord, if you allow it, if it would be in your will, would you allow me to hook up with someone that I'll never see again, right? Now, to be clear, he certainly may allow it. Like that actually might happen. But I don't think that is really considering the Lord. Like even considering the Lord in your plans might make you think through, hey, is this actually honoring to him? The point is, would you consider the Lord? Because it even can impact what you are doing. Instead, what it could look like, hey, Lord, hey, I would really like this job. Like I've got an interview for it tomorrow. I want to do everything I can. I don't know the future, but I mean, if it would be your will, would you give me this job? And I just want to say, hey, if that's your prayer, you are, again, likely thinking through, will this job actually honor the Lord or not? If I could say, my plea is just simply this, just consider the Lord. That is how you honor him. Now, we say often at New City, what would Jesus do if he were me? And sometimes you might answer that question and do something that he actually wouldn't do. Like he actually wouldn't have made that decision. But the fact that you tried and you sought wisdom and you prayed, I think even if you make the quote unquote wrong decision, you have still honored God. But James is saying, man, consider the Lord. Because here's what they're doing instead. In verse 16 of James chapter 4, he continues. He says, but as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So again, the problem for James is not planning, but it is the underlying attitude of that planning. Now, he uses the word boast here, which is or that's translated as the word boast, which we don't always use in typical like modern American English today, but it actually is a good translation. Some translations say, but as it is, you take pride in your arrogance. But the reason why that's not a good translation is because pride in the scriptures is always negative. Boasting in the scriptures is actually neutral. It just depends on what you're boasting in. So for example, if you're familiar with some other books in the New Testament, Paul talks about boasting in the Lord. That is a good thing. So what makes your boasting good or bad has to do with what you're boasting in or where your boasting comes from. If your boasting is in your plans and your ideas, then it is not in God and your consideration of him. Now again, it's not wrong to have plans. The issue is, especially for those of us that are following Jesus, is if we assume, here's what I'm going to do and it's what I'm going to look like. So I'll give you an example. So I've been doing this pastor thing for a while, and it is one of the great privileges and joy is to meet with so many people over the years, to talk about life, what's going on. And there's been times over the years where it's been like, typically it's like guys in their young 20s. And some of these guys are like, they're go-getters, man. And they got like this 10-year plan. Now, I just want to say, I do respect I'm thinking through this, I'm going to work hard. Like I respect that. But sometimes they got this 10-year plan and they're like, here's how much I'm going to make. Here's how much I'm going to save. I'm going to meet a wife at some point. She's going to have this job. We're going to have this many kids. She's going to spend this much money. We're going to live in this type of house. And they're going to go. And I'm like, bro, you might need a woman to help you with some of these plans. That's all I'm saying. Like she could help you out here, right? But you like here's what is going to happen. And I'm like, well, I don't know that it's going to happen exactly like that. Again, I'm not knocking like the dream and desire, but the way it's talked about, it's like, it's going to be this way. And I'm like, well, there's one thing again in this 10-year plan that might not happen, and it's the wife if this plan is not adjustable. And so again, just want to say, hey, again, I'm not knocking the plan, but it's like, hey, if this is going to happen the way I say it's going to happen, well, then that's kind of like, hey, man, maybe are you actually considering the Lord and being willing to what the changes that he might bring? So again, what can often happen, even with good intentions, if we're not careful, it could just be like we're just excited about a plan. And so we think, hey, here's where I'm going to go. And because we're so excited about it, there's no concept in our mind that things could go differently. Like I think of where Christina and I got married. We got married between our junior and senior year of college. And then right after our senior year of college ended, we were in this really janky, like rundown apartment. And we're looking at these townhomes. And we're going to move. And I started my master's degree like the day after graduation. We were helping plant this church, and so I was a pastoral intern part-time, which means I worked for free. And Christina was doing the kids ministry, so she did get paid part-time. She also worked as a barista part-time, and I worked at New Balance part-time. So like we just like had no money, but we had a budget, and we're going through it, and we're looking at all these places, and we find this place that we like really like. And after we leave, Christina's like, well, that's great. We can make it work. It'll be tight, but we can make it work with our budget. And I'm thinking, well, maybe. But you know, when you like renting apartments and stuff, it's like every day online, it like fluctuates a few bucks. And so I'm like, but it might go down like $5 tomorrow. And for us, back then, $5 was a big deal. And so I wait till the next day, and that joker shoots up $40-something. Now, for us, we're adults. We have savings now. We're good. Like $40 a month, we'd be okay. When we were 21, 22, like that was like, it was already a stretch. And so I remember calling like some wise mentors, like, what do I do, whatever. And they're like, well, if she really wants it, then, you should probably try to figure this out. And so anyway, long story short, we go back in like the next day, we talked to the lady behind the desk, and she it was really kind to us and somehow took $10 off our rent or whatever. And so we moved in. But in my mind, again, it's either going to go up a few bucks or down a few bucks. So there's no point in like rushing it. There was no concept for me, like this thing could like drastically change by a lot of money for us in that particular season of our life. And so we should consider the Lord. Again, for James, planning is not evil, but the arrogance and lack of consideration of the Lord is. That this is going to be how things turn out means we might be put into trouble. So again, James is writing to believers who some of them are being arrogant about their planning. And then he says this in verse 17. He says, so it is sin to know the good and yet not do it. It's sin to know the good and yet not do it, which means what James is telling us here, that sin is not simply something that we do, but it can also be something that we don't. It can be something that we don't do, and both can be equally wrong. Which is a challenge for us because we tend to think like I'm a good person or I'm not a good person based solely on what I do. If I did this good thing, then there's more good for me. If I did this bad thing, then I'm not quite as good of a person as I was if I hadn't done it, right? If I do more good than I do bad, then I am good. That's how culturally we typically view ourselves. But James is saying, hey, what about the things that you should have done and you didn't? Because for James, he's saying that matters too. Now, specifically the context here, James is talking about considering the Lord or not considering the Lord. That those of us that are followers of Jesus, if we're arrogantly planning our days, hey, that is a sin. But this also can just apply to any area of our life where we know God is leading us to do something or asking us to do something and we are not doing it. Or put another way, sin is not only doing what is wrong, it is also not doing what is right. Not only doing what is wrong, it is also not doing what is right when you know the right thing to do. So this isn't just like, well, I'm not sure what to do. This is like, hey, you know what you should be doing, and you're not doing it. Right? Again, the context for here is planning, but it's applicable to any area of your life. So I would just say, hey, we should ask ourselves as we read this, is there anything right now in your life that God is asking you to do that you are not doing? Is there anything right now, big or small, in your life or in my life, that God is asking us to do that we are not doing? Because James would say it would be a sin to be disobedient in that way. And then he continues by saying this in chapter 5, verse 1. He says, "Come now, you rich people, weep and wail over the miseries that are coming to you." Now, this first section of chapter 5, as we're getting near to the end of the letter, verses 1 through 6, it is actually likely directed at non-believers. Now, we know that because he says weep and wail here in verse 1, which was a term used in the Old Testament repeatedly for the reaction of the wicked people in the day of judgment when the God returns and judges the living and the dead, and the wicked, those who have rejected God, would weep and wail in their sin. And in this section, James gives a harsh language only, and he gives no encouragement. So in the end of James 4, he's talking to believers who are arrogantly planning their lives, and now he's talking to unbelievers who are kind of being arrogant in their wealth. Now, the wealthy people he is talking to here, or he's directing this section to, is likely rich landowners, as we'll see here in a second, who oppressed others with their wealth. And again, in the ancient world, unlike today where there are many ways to become wealthy, like you could have bought a Bitcoin by accident 15 years ago and now you're a millionaire, like there's lots of different ways to do it. In the ancient world, really the only way to become wealthy was to own land, because most everybody, like over 90% of people, worked land in some way. And so if you own land, you were wealthy. So you have these rich landowners who are being sinful in how they treat the people that are working for them. It says this in verse 2. He says, "Your wealth has rotted and your clothes are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have stored up treasure in the last days." I just want to be clear here. It is not wealth in and of itself that James is and will condemn. It is what they are doing with it. That's the issue. And if we're being honest, what we can do with our own resources if we are not careful. That these wealthy landowners were storing it up for themselves in their future. Now, ironically, what they were really storing up was the judgment of God on their behalf for what they were doing with their wealth and how they were acquiring it. Ironically, they're storing up God's judgment. Then verse 4, he says this, he says, "Look, the pay that you withheld from the workers who mowed your fields cries out, and the outcry of the harvesters has reached the ears of the Lord of armies." That these wealthy landowners are defrauding their workers who work their land. They are cheating their workers to support their own lifestyles and their own desires. And God hears the cries of those they have wronged. He's saying God sees it, and God sees everything. Verse 5, he says, "You have lived luxuriously on earth and have indulged yourselves. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter." Now again, day of slaughter here is likely a reference to Jesus' return, where again, he will judge the living and the dead. That these rich people are like cows in the field that are fattened up in order to be killed and eaten. So in the ancient world, if you were wealthy and you had animals and livestock, you would have a fattened calf that you would feed and get nice and plump for the next festival or the next celebration that you were having. The irony here is that they are gorging, these wealthy people are gorging themselves on their own wealth, that they're preparing themselves to be slaughtered and eaten. And then verse 6, he says this, he says, "You have condemned, you have murdered the righteous who do not resist you." That what they're doing is they're actually oppressing and condemning those who are actually righteous. Now, righteous here could refer to God's people, or it simply could refer to someone who is innocent and being treated unfairly. In this context, it's likely both in this situation. That you have many of these Jewish Christians who are living in Jerusalem, working other people's land, and are being oppressed and marginalized unfairly by these landowners. And so they need to be careful. Now, I want to say this. It would be wrong if you only read this passage, why you should read all the scripture, but if you only read this passage, you could come to an incorrect biblical conclusion. It would be wrong to assume that therefore what James is saying here is that if you're rich and wealthy, you are unsaved and going to be judged. And if you are poor and marginalized, you are automatically saved and automatically righteous. However, it should be pointed out that the more you have and the more I have, the less inclined we are to walk with God and to think that we need him because we can kind of control more of the things in our life, right? The more you have, the more you're going to think you're okay. And the less you have, the more your eyes are going to be open to the fact that you're not in control. So for example, naturally having less, like if you have less, it can create a dependency on God. Like if you're thinking, man, where is my next rent check going to come from? Where am I going to live next week? How am I going to afford this? Where's my next meal going to come from? It can create a God sufficiency instead of a self-sufficiency because you naturally kind of see, hey, I don't have everything figured out. Whereas on the flip side, if you have things and you're doing okay, it can create a natural self-sufficiency because you think you are good. That being said, again, the converse here is also true that not every wealthy person looks to themselves. Not every wealthy person just assumes that they're good, but it is easier to do so, and it is harder to resist when you do have all of your basic needs met. But having plenty leads us to assume that we don't need God. It leads to arrogance, just like James talked about in James chapter 4 at the end that we read, that you kind of think, I know what my future's going to look like, that I don't need to consider God. So in the same way, again, just like not every poor person turns to God, not every wealthy person relies on themselves. But again, for our maybe Western American context, as we read this, we just understand, hey, it is harder to walk with Jesus the more that you have, so we should be careful. We should be careful. It's kind of funny. I had this conversation sometimes with Finley, our oldest daughter, recently. I was talking to her telling her how we're rich. I was like, we're rich. And she's like, no, we're not. I was like, we are rich. Now, here's how I know we're rich. I don't know if it's like this for you guys, where you guys live in your homes, but in our house, we can literally control the temperature, like inside. We can set it to whatever we want to. We have these machines. Where you push a button and it will wash your clothes and then it will dry your clothes. So you just press a button. I've got this machine in my kitchen where you can like put a dirty dish into it, and when you take it out, it's clean. Like it is amazing. Like we have 2 vehicles. Like we have 2 cars, not just one, but 2. We actually have so much money that we like pay for animals. It's like give them a place to live when they could just as easily be outside. And sometimes they like to do that and they don't come home for 3 days, right? Like we have all that we need. Now it's funny because in her mind, it's like we're not rich because comparatively to those around us, we're the same. This conversation started, and I'll mention this again next week, but this conversation started because she went to stay at one of her friend's house who was like, even more rich than we are. I mean, this is like, they have like an 8-bedroom house. They've got a pool in their backyard. They go to Hawaii every year. And I'm not knocking them, like I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm not knocking them for it. But they have a lot of money. And Finley asked her friend, she said, are you rich? Like the first time she went to her house. And her friend said no. And Finley was quite confused because she's like, they have more money than we do. Like they clearly, and I was like, well, Finley, she doesn't think she's rich because in her neighborhood, everyone makes the same. I said, Finley, you don't think you're rich because in our neighborhood, everybody's like living the same standard of life. And so it can be really easy to assume we don't have much if we compare to our neighbors, but not necessarily compared to the rest of the world. And so again, particularly here, James is talking to wealthy people who are relying on material things and their wealth to sustain themselves instead of the Lord. And so that said, again, as followers of Jesus, if you're a follower of Jesus here this morning, we need to know that material things aren't bad in and of themselves, but they do present a significant obstacle to the kingdom of God. That they can. This is why in Proverbs chapter 30, the author of Proverbs writes, I think, a very challenging prayer when he says this, give me neither poverty nor wealth. Feed me with the food I need. Otherwise, I might have too much and deny you, saying, who is the Lord? Or I might have nothing and steal, profaning the name of my God. And so again, we should read at passages like we've read this morning with humility and concern, right? Where is my stuff leading me to arrogantly think I am good? Either in my plan, my future, or in my material possessions. And again, it's a challenging because in our day and age, which has probably been like this for most of human history, right? Amassing wealth is not only condoned, but it's actually admired, right? It's a symbol, it's a status symbol. And so as Christians, we should ask ourselves, if you're a follower of Jesus, man, where do I have too much? And where am I letting it lead me astray from following the Lord? Because if I could summarize maybe the beginning of James chapter 5, whether you have a lot or a little, here's what I think James is saying. Whether you have much or little, be dependent on God. Whether you have much or little, the encouragement here is for us to be dependent not on ourselves and our plans and our possessions, but on the Lord. And so again, we should ask ourselves when we read something like this, am I dependent on God? Are you dependent on God? And remember, the book of James is all about how so easy for us to say and think we believe something. We can have the right answer, but how we live shows whether or not that is true. It's easy for us to say, well, yes, I'm dependent on God, but how is your life? Does your life demonstrate that? And I think for many of us, a good test of our dependency on God is our generosity. It's our generosity that we say or we think we depend on God, but what does the use of our resources say? And hear me, I'm not just talking about like giving to the church. I'm just saying your resources in general. Are you generous with them, or are you kind of keep them close to your chest? Because that shows, am I depending on the Lord or myself? I think there are certainly exceptions to this, but I think a good maybe beginning standard when it talks about generosity to like, hey, how am I doing in this area? I like to maybe just explain this way. Whatever your socioeconomic status is, however much you make, whatever neighborhood you live in, whatever that is your standard of living lower than those in your circle of influence, in your tax bracket? Is your standard of living lower than theirs because of your generosity? Like, is there anything that you don't have or that you miss out on because of your generosity? That if you were not generous, you could have that thing or you could do that thing. I think maybe having a slightly lower standard of living than maybe your coworkers is a good litmus test. Now, hear me. There are certainly exceptions to this. Like if you have like mountains of medical debt, if you're a single parent, if you're caring for someone who's got an illness, like there are times where like if I lowered my standard of living, I would like live in a box. And so like this is not for everybody. I think for those of us that would say, hey, man, I have some needs, maybe there's some things that I want, but I'm doing okay. Like, is there anything that we miss out on because of our generosity? I think that's a great place to begin when it comes to being more generous. And so again, if I could sum up all of this, I said in the beginning, a question for us is, how do you know if you trust in God or yourself? That was the question we began with this morning. And I would answer it by giving you another question. And how you answer this question shows whether or not you're trusting in God and yourself. And that's this: are you willing to do what God has asked you to do? Here's how you know if you trust in God or yourself. Are you willing to do what He has asked you to do? Are you willing? See that? Yeah, that guitar. Are you willing? Are you willing to consider Him in your plans or your future? Like, are you willing to consider Him? Or are you so like, here's what I want to do, and I want it so bad that I'm going to go for it? Are you willing to consider Him and how you spend and use your resources? Are you willing to consider Him that? Maybe some of you right now, are you willing to submit your life to Him? Are you willing to come to Jesus as not just like your friend or like your buddy that like you try really hard and He answers your prayers, but like say, hey, I want you to be Lord of my life. Again, it's easy for us to maybe forget a little bit the context of who James is writing to here. He's not writing to people who are like trying really hard and saying, hey, keep trying harder and then God will meet you in the middle. He's writing to people who have already said, hey, I do not have everything all together. I need Jesus to do for me what I could not do for myself. Right? The book of James is honoring the Lord in response to what Jesus has done for you. That while we were sinners, Christ died for us. We celebrated Easter a couple weeks ago, that God came to save sinners, that those who are broken and in need of rescuing. And in our response to the salvation of God, we live in a way that honors Him so that other people in our life can also see and experience the grace of Jesus. Or maybe some of you have been coming the last couple of weeks and you know, man, today's the day. Not tomorrow, not when you get all your questions answered, but like today's the day that you need to submit your life to Him and receive His grace. Maybe for some of us, man, are you willing to have that conversation? Like maybe invite that friend to church or just to tell them about this Jesus guy, about why maybe you live and do the certain things that you do. Are you willing to be generous with what God has given you? Are you willing, all I have to say, are you willing to put yourself in a situation where you have to be dependent on God? Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to do what God has asked you to do? That's the challenge from us in this text. Hey, thanks so much for checking out this video. We upload new videos every week to help encourage you in your faith in Jesus. So be sure to subscribe to this channel so that you never miss a thing.